Hello students, welcome back. So we're going to talk about the topic of externalities. So externalities have to do with a general idea that we call a market failure. So remember that we have deadweight losses, and that's how we see a market failure. So the market's failing to be efficient. Okay. So the idea of an externality is given here in the definition: an uncompensated impact of one person's actions on the well-being of a bystander. So normally what we're talking about is there are two primary parties to a transaction, the buyer and the seller. An externality is something that happens to somebody else who's not the buyer or the seller. So I'll call them the third party. And so externalities cause markets to be inefficient because the third parties are part of society too, and what we're concerned about is society's welfare. And so their costs or benefits aren't taken into consideration by the buyer and the seller. The buyer and seller are, by definition in economics, self-interested. So they're just not going to consider the impacts on third parties unless there's some government regulation or some other reason other than just the basic behavior that we see in the demand and supply model. So in our context, we're not going to assume that the third parties are being considerate or thinking, or excuse me, that the buyer and the seller are being considerate and thinking about the third party. The third party is going to be neglected, and so the market will be inefficient. So this is basically just repeating what we said before. I'll pause a second so you can read the slide. The impact on the bystander, if it's a bad one, it's something that's a cost, we call it a negative externality. And sometimes you can have a bystander that gets a beneficial impact, and we call that a positive externality. The negative externalities are easy to think about. It's cigarette smoke, barking dogs, automobile exhaust, loud stereos in apartment buildings. These are all the sorts of things that annoy people and happen in the absence of any sort of regulation. The idea is that, like with automobile pollution, that people, they might have cars that don't have proper exhaust systems, and they just drive around and they don't consider that they're going to cause other people to have heart attacks or asthma attacks or things like that because they're polluting the air. Again, in the absence of some sort of government intervention. So positive externalities are normally associated with things we end up calling public goods, but you may not think of restored historic buildings just because they're beautiful to look at. Did they generate a positive externality? And immunizations are a good example, because if someone gets immunized, sure, they're not going to get sick, but they're not going to make other people sick either. So there's a benefit that goes to other people. And research into new technologies. So generally, primary discoveries are made in universities, and then they're put to work in the private sector. And so, for example, if you think about primary research that was done into the space race, going to the moon and those sorts of things, there are lots of goods and services that we have today that we wouldn't have if it wasn't for the discoveries that were done for the space race. And so, for example, like microwave technology is one example. And so, but the people that are building microwaves today and selling them to consumers didn't pay any of the research costs associated with the development of the microwave. So it was a benefit to those businesses. Remember, the third-party benefit, it could be directly to consumers, but it could be to producers too, because they're part of society. So let's do an example. So the supply curve reflects the seller's private costs, and the demand reflects the buyer's private value for the good. And this is our market equilibrium and our market quantity. So we can have a negative externality that leads the market to produce a larger than socially desirable quantity, so too much of the good, and a positive externality leads the market to produce. Actually, this slide is wrong. It should say too little of the good, a smaller a quantity than is socially desirable. So the market for aluminum is a good case because the quantity produced and consumed in the market is efficient in the sense that it maximizes the sum of consumer and producer surplus. But if the factory is emitting pollution, which is a negative externality, then the cost to society of producing aluminum is larger than the cost to aluminum producers. So again, there's smoke coming out, and that's causing an additional cost on society. So for each unit of aluminum produced, the social cost includes all of the private costs of the producer, plus the cost of the pollution to the community that's not the aluminum producer. So here we have, again, the aluminum producer's costs in the supply curve here, and you've got the demand for the people that buy the aluminum products. Now, there's the market equilibrium quantity that balances demand and supply. Now there's this additional cost, which we show by shifting up the cost to include this cost of pollution, which we're calling this external cost. And then the social cost is both the private cost and this external cost. So this new quantity is the socially optimal quantity, and you can see here in the case of the negative externality that the market is overproducing aluminum because it's not considering all the costs, mainly the costs of pollution here that we're talking about. So the intersection of the demand curve and the social cost curve determines the optimal output for society. The socially optimal level of output's less than the market equilibrium quantity. And one of the strategies that is sometimes used is called internalizing the externality, and that involves somehow altering the costs so that the producers will take account of those external effects on their actions. So think of regulating producers so they don't produce as much pollution. So, and then if you do that properly, you'll get to that socially optimal level of output. So the government normally can internalize an externality. One of the techniques is by imposing a tax on the producer to reduce the quantity of the good that's produced that's generating that externality. And so, I mean, this is really common that there are taxes or fees associated with polluting industries. So now we'll move to the idea of a positive externality. The positive externality, remember, is an external benefit to the third parties. And then the social value of the good exceeds the private value. And one example is, again, a technology spillover. So when a firm designs something new, or it's designed by a university, but it enters that pool of technological knowledge, and society as a whole benefits from that. So here's one example that's often used. We have a private value for education. Now, this is education, like think for a private university or a private school, and then you've got these costs of the school of supplying the education, and then there would be this market equilibrium quantity. But many economists have argued, and other people have argued, that there's this additional benefit, this social value, to having a more educated populace. And we could talk about different ways that education generates these benefits to third parties. But if you just think about it in terms of, and the easiest argument to make is that we live in a democracy, and more educated people tend to make better decisions about how to run the government. So you'll more likely get voters voting for things that are sensible if they're well educated. And we all are going to share in the way that the government operates in terms of the consequences for our society. So education has this additional benefit. So you can see there, what we've done is we've taken the demand and we've added to it, we've shifted it up by the amount of this external benefit, okay? And because of that, the socially optimal quantity is greater than what the market would produce on its own. So this is a case for giving subsidies even to private, like Catholic schools and things like that, that the government should be willing to pay something because there's this extra benefit that's going to society above and beyond what the families are paying for that private education on their own. So the intersection of the supply curve and that social benefit or social value curve determines the optimal level of output. The optimal output level is more than the equilibrium quantity. So the market underproduces these goods that are good for society in general because it doesn't take into consideration the benefits on third parties. So the social value of the good exceeds the private value of the good. And the main way that the opposite of a tax is when the government takes money from you, a subsidy is when they give you money. It's used as the primary method for attempting to internalize positive externalities. So you subsidize the beneficial product. In this case, beneficial education, right? So industrial policy, the government intervention in the economy aims to promote technology enhancing industries, and one of the main ways we do that is with patent laws. So because again the patent gives a property right to the invention, which means that the patent holder is able to capture some of the additional benefit. And the patent internalizes externality. So it's a little bit different than a direct cash subsidy, but by the government ensuring that the developer of the new technology owns a right to it, they encourage that inventive activity. Okay. So the question is government action always needed for the problem of externalities to be resolved? Remember, the thing that was really nice about the way that the private market operates is it doesn't require any government intervention. And so people can go and trade and produce, buy and sell goods, and they can achieve these efficient outcomes without any direct government intervention. And sometimes what you see is there are private solutions, and these are the main ones. There are these moral codes and social sanctions that encourage people to be like polite to their neighbors, so they don't, generate too much loud music or have lots of parties. There are private charitable organizations that try to, support people who want to get immunized. Or get off of drugs or those types of things. And then sometimes businesses will try to enhance their ability to capture the benefits of developing a new technology by integrating different types of businesses. And then sometimes contracts between parties develop. So a general idea that captures this notion that people can bargain in order to manage or capture the benefits and costs of an externality is called the Coase theorem. And what the Coase theorem says is that if private parties can bargain without costs over the allocation of resources, they can solve the problem of externalities on their own. Now, it says without costs, but generally there are transactions costs, and those are the costs that parties incur in the process of agreeing to follow through on a bargain. And so, the Coase theorem assumes there are no costs of bargaining, but, generally there are costs. So the Coase theorem points a direction for private parties to solve the problem on their own, but also points out a flaw which commonly exists, which are these transaction costs. So sometimes the private solution fails because the transactions cost can be so high that the agreement isn't possible. And what are other sorts of solutions? Well, when there are significant externalities and private solutions aren't possible, the government can attempt through what we call command and control policies or through market-based policies. So market command and control policies are where the government tells you, no, you can't have a party after 11 p.m. at night. A market-based policy would be something like, well, the government requires you to buy some sort of a permit, and they try to set the permit price so that people won't have too many of these late night parties. Here are the classic examples of again, command and control policies. Forbid certain behaviors, require other behaviors. So, for example, the government requires students to be immunized before they can attend school. That's command and control. And the Environmental Protection Agency limits pollution levels to certain quantities of pollution. Market-based policies, again, they use prices, and specifically these taxes and subsidies, which get embedded in prices to align private incentives with socially efficient outcomes. So the corrective tax that's most commonly referred to is called a Pigovian tax, and that's a strange word, but Pigot was an economist in the 19th century who first proposed this, and so he gets the credit for these types of corrective taxes. And so a tax discourages an activity, so it's normally applied to negative externalities. Positive externalities would be a subsidy of some sort that you would apply. You would give people money instead of, punishing them through taxes if they were doing something that generated a positive externality. So examples of regulation versus Pigovian taxes: if the EPA decides it wants to reduce the amount of pollution coming from a specific plant, the EPA could either tell the firm to reduce its pollution by a specific amount, which is regulation, or they could levy a tax of a given amount on each unit of the pollution that the firm emits, and that would be a Pigovian tax example. So there are other market-based policy examples, some that are more flexible because they are not just a specific tax amount. And one of the most popular that's often discussed in the media is these market-based policies, or what we call tradable permits. So tradable pollution permits allow the voluntary transfer of a right to pollute from one firm to another. So by trading, there develops a market and a price for these pollution permits. And a market for these permits eventually develops, and a firm can reduce pollution at a low cost. And that type of firm may prefer to sell its permit to a firm that has a high cost of pollution reduction. So you still get the pollution reduction, but it's done by the firm that can do it at least cost. So here's an example of a Pigovian tax. So you have a Pigovian tax, and you have a demand for the right to pollute, and you end up with a certain quantity of pollution generated. This is different than the taxes that we've seen before, because the tax is the only price in the market for pollution here. So it just comes in as a straight line as the amount of the tax being charged, which is P. So we set it at the price of pollution, and together with the demand for pollution, it determines the quantity of pollution. So for pollution permits, you could do the same thing. You just set the supply of pollution permits, and then if you let companies trade them, then they'll end up going to the companies that have the lowest cost for pollution abatement or reducing their pollution, and you get a price out of there. So you get the same quantity of pollution as you would with the tax, and together with the demand curve, it determines that price of pollution, and it should be the same as the perfect Pigovian tax that'll target that quantity. So that's a summary of everything that you need to know about externalities, and I'll be talking to you soon.